welcome to my esteemed panel. I mean, when I heard that I was going to be talking to this very esteemed panel of speakers, I was very, very privileged. And of course, Mr. Abebe joining us virtually, welcome again. I will be taking some questions from the audience. I mean, as the firstborn child in my family, I'm programmed to share. So I promise not to hog them all to myself. Public debt as a share of GDP in Africa has been rising quickly, exacerbated in part by the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The debt burden has been even more pronounced in sub-Saharan Africa, with debt to GDP around 56% last year, the highest level ever since the early 2000s. However, debt is not always a monster. When used effectively and serviced well, it can unlock massive growth and development. But if not, it can become a burden. As a major holder of strategic resources and commodities, there's no doubt Africa is a continent full of potential for fast-paced growth. I just want to kick us off with a general question for the speakers. How can African countries in distress leverage the resources and the commodities at their disposal to reduce their debt burden and risk? Minister, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you very much for having me to discuss this important topic of debt. As you were mentioning, there is a squeeze in the financing globally, but especially in Africa, and all my colleagues, ministers of economy and finance and government in general, are really struggling with the burden of this debt. I'm going to answer your question, but not exactly your question. You're right. Africa has big potential, many resources to create conditions for proper growth for youth, for in different regions, not rely anymore only on commodities, and create, I would say, more value, more industry, and so many reforms also on the fiscal side. And policymakers are really busy to reform and to create conditions for growth. But let's be, I would say, pragmatic. This debt crisis is due to shocks that are coming from outside Africa. And this raise in the cost and the burden of debt is first the tightening of the financial conditions coming from the West, from the US. Mm-hmm. It's coming from the raise in the dollars that hits, I would say, the currencies in Africa. And as a result, the spreads that are, I would say, valuating disproportionately the risk of Africa. The risk premium is more or less 3 times, and Anne-Laure can confirm what we see in the emerging markets. So definitely, as policymakers, we have the responsibility to have the proper policies to manage this crisis, this debt burden, and create proper conditions for growth. But I think that the international community has also its part, and its duty also to help Africa solve this crisis in these unprecedented shocks that we are facing.
Abebe, I saw you nodding. Do you want to come in?
Happy to. I think the minister really puts her finger on exactly what the challenge countries are facing now is. And of course, she's well placed to do so. For sure, there were vulnerabilities even before the pandemic. Debt levels had been going up. But for the most part, across the region, because countries had been investing in important areas like infrastructure, in health, in education, the increase in debt pre-pandemic, I think, reflected just the right approach. What governments did not do as well, I think, is collect the rates of return on this investment through the tax system sufficiently. But what has happened subsequently, the 3-4 shocks, and we tend to underestimate just how brutal brutal these shocks have been to the region, to countries not as resilient, without, countries without deep financial markets. That really is what's pushing countries to the edge, and in some cases, creating solvency challenges. In terms of how we respond, what the way forward is, again, I echo what the minister said. I think, where debt is clearly unsustainable, you need debt restructuring, and recognize that this debt needs to be treated. But the vast majority of countries are in a situation where they need a combination of reforms coupled with significant support from the international community. And I think that is the way forward. And, the debt challenge has to be seen as also a financing challenge, particularly in circumstances like the current one, where borrowing costs are keeping, elevated borrowing costs globally are, denying countries access to capital markets abroad. So, I'm very happy to note the IMF, of course, has been playing a very important role, supporting countries by providing liquidity over the last couple of years, and will continue to do so. And that's part of the answer.
Anne and Aminu, do you want to just take us through maybe the financing side of it?
Yes, maybe one comment, because when we're talking about the cost of debt, Minister is of course completely right about saying that the cost of debt is really too high. I'm going to even make it more caricatural, because most of the spending that government have to do are social spending. When you talk about health, education, if you borrow in the capital market at 8%, 9%, 10%, this is completely unsustainable, because you're not putting it to something that will yield those returns immediately. Of course, they will yield a lot of returns for your population, but this is kind of like a generation investment that you're doing. So to me, yes, we have too much debt, that's for sure, but we also, if I may, we may have the wrong debt, and that's what we need to be working on, because we need more of this concessional financing, we need more of this, when I call cheap financing, you understand what I mean by this, but at lower rate, so that the debt can be sustainable. And this will come and has to come from the IFIs that have already done a lot of work on this. We can be even more innovative with some blended finance, which I think is extremely important, so mixing kind of like the different sources of funding so that the cost of funding can come low. But I think we also have to recognize that because, and Abe said it exactly right, because of the shocks, we are in a very particular situation. Because before Africa, and I hate when we say Africa because it makes it, it's wrong, but I'm going to be too simplistic. But the countries were developing themselves. In order to develop yourself, you need to have resources. So yes, you needed to go through the debt. It's true what Abe said around the fiscal was not probably collected in the way that it needed to be. But because it is like this, what you have is fiscal that is not to the level it needs to be, the debt burden that has increased substantially, so you have almost no, if not limited fiscal space. So when a country has to choose between repaying its debt or doing health or education spending, I mean, it's completely wrong. Mm-hmm. So we need to address this as an urgent matter, while we also need to recognize that down the line, we need sustainable economies. And developing an economy, doing exports strategy, doing economic growth, this is not something that you do in 1 year and 2 years. Those are very long-term rhythm. So we also need to recognize that the problem is short-term, immediate, while part of the solutions are also long-term. And this discrepancy between short-term, medium, long-term is very hard to kind of like fix, and that's the problem we're currently in.
Aminu?
Perfect. Honestly speaking, I align very well with all that has been mentioned by my colleagues. I think my contributions would be threefold. I think the first is we also have to determine how we leverage local currency, long-term capital within these frontier economies, particularly pension funds and insurance companies. At the NSI, we founded a company called InfraCredit that essentially is a financial guarantor that provides guarantees to bonds issued by local companies in order to motivate domestic capital from pension funds to infrastructure projects. And I think that has worked exceptionally well. That's the first thing. The second thing is, from an industrial policy perspective, I think countries also have to find a way to encourage both backward integration as well as forward value addition for a lot of these minerals that we are blessed with. And I think thirdly and finally is on the tax side. I think when you look at African economies, particularly ours in Nigeria, relative to our GDP, our collections is really, really low. for a plethora of reasons, but I think principally that trust between the government and the taxpayer really, really needs to be developed, so that taxpayers are sure that there is a return on the tax receipts that comes from their business to the government. But I think if the government can mobilize that collaboration between government agencies and put in place the apparatus to enhance tax receipts, I think there's also a potential funding source more effective than debt.
Right, and Abe, I want to come to you, particularly on the tax side of things. What do you think are some of the reforms that we could see in some of the countries that need to improve their tax to GDP ratio? What should be done in terms of perhaps repairing that trust that Aminu talked about?
Yeah, Aminu, I think made a very important point, which is ultimately how much governments are able to collect by way of taxes is about the social contract that people feel comfortable with paying taxes, comfortable that the resources are going to be used in the right areas and the right ways. Second, I think so just on the first point, it's important to make sure that, of course, governments can demonstrate that the money that they're collecting is going to the right places, minimizing corruption, making sure that you're getting value for money in the investment projects that are being selected, fewer vanity projects and more projects that really appeal to our populations. Investments in health, education in particular, that Anne-Laure also touched on, really, really very important part of the equation. But second also is that a little bit more bravery, I think, is needed by governments to go out and collect taxes. There are a lot, in many of our countries, you have a lot of tax incentives, which I'm not sure are always needed to entice investment. So broadening the tax base, minimizing those kind of incentives only to the ones that are absolutely necessary will be important. There's also quite a lot of activity that goes on in terms of, companies seeking to minimize the tax burden, shifting taxes through transfer pricing. So trying to get at those will also be really very important. So it's a combination of those things that will be important to ensure that tax to GDP ratios over time can go up. In our countries. Now, at the fund, we do a lot of work supporting countries, both on the technical side in particular. But I have to say that the political side is as important, the will to go and collect these taxes. And our experience is that, on average, countries are able to, when they put their minds to it, collect between 0.5 and 1 percentage points of GDP a year. To collect, and so if you can sustain that over a 3-4 year period, it really, moves countries to a level where they should be able to, minimize the debt servicing burden in the vast majority of cases.
Well, China is the biggest bilateral lender in Africa. How crucial is that relationship that China has when it comes to the debt crisis?
It's a very interesting question because we always have to go back to the initial time where China landed. Because we sometimes tend to be looking into now versus when it happened. It actually happened a couple of years ago. And at this time, it was also because the risk of Africa was potentially not very well measured, that at a given time, China decided, well, we want to invest in Africa. Of course, they had their own agenda. I'm not naive about it. But they were the ones who could provide capital on projects. And more importantly, they were providing capital, long-term capital. So typically, if they had infrastructure, they were willing to provide 10-year, 20 years money, which kind of like you couldn't find in the market or anywhere. And because they had this system of contracts and financing, the financing looked on paper very attractive because it was low rates. Actually, the value was, split between the two, but still it looked kind of like attractive. So at this time, you had a surge of countries to develop their infrastructure with China money, and of course for China to also have their own companies develop the economy. So now it ends up that indeed the debt levels are too high, and that one needs to be thinking about restructuring, grace periods, as Abe said. But in order for it to be also acceptable by China, we cannot forget the past and the circumstances of the lending. We cannot forget the diplomatic relationships that countries have with China. But now, yet, faced with a debt crisis, every debtor needs to make an effort. And if you're the largest lender, you, of course, also need to make an effort, give grace periods, extend the debt, and if and when it's acceptable, haircuts and necessary. So all of this is a package. But I just wanted to put perspective, because I think if we do not recognize this, somehow the discussions are going to be much more difficult with China not accepting this.
Right. Minister, I want to, bring a little bit of positivity to this conversation. Morocco's bid to get off the FATF grey list has been successful, a positive development, of course, which will likely make it easier to raise debt and improve investment ratings. What are some of the lessons learned and the opportunities that lie ahead for the country and its development, especially after Morocco issued a $2.5 billion bond on the international financial market?
Actually, under the guidance of His Majesty the King, Morocco has always been committed, actually, to push terrorism and anti-laundry money. But we had this conversation with Gafi saying that we don't comply with all the processes. So we had, I would say, to have a proper task force to get out of this grey list. What we need to understand in our economies is that the financial sector, because it is, I would say, in worldwide standard, are quite familiar with these processes, have the proper technologies, have the proper, I would say, talent experts to do so. The challenge was the informal economy, the non-financial economy. And we explained that we have cultural way of doing, I would say, business. Women in our countries, I would say, their savings go into gold. So they won't go to any administration to just disclose how much gold they're hiding from their husband or mother-in-law. So what I need to say is that definitely to do so, to have all the stakeholders committed, I would say, to do all the effort to go out of this grey list, you need a strong leadership. So, of course, we have the leadership of our Majesty the King, but also the Prime Minister have put a lot of energy, because you cannot, it's not the problem of the financial sector, of the Minister of Economy and Finance. But it definitely helps to get, I would say, better financial condition. But let me tell you that the financial institution, the financial communities knew about Morocco. So we were, I would say, blessed to raise this $2.5 billion. We could even raise more, but we are taking care of our microeconomics and debt level. But the financial community has some type of intimacy with all the IFIs, with all the financial institutions. I know very well how much Morocco has been doing strong reform, have a very strong, I would say, agenda of macroeconomics, I would say, reforms on the midterm. So it's not the fact that we are going, it helps, definitely helps, but what helps more is to have, I would say, a vision, to have an ambition, and to have real milestones and KPIs, which I think we are delivering in Morocco. So you were talking about the tax revenues. We used some of the recipes that Abe have just described, and in 2021 we could raise the tax revenue by 21%. We did the job on the corporate side, building trust, having, I would say, a mid and long-term, I would say, visibility on tax. It is important to build trust. But on the other side, what is important is our agenda of social protection helps also a lot to increase the tax revenues. Because people were not willing to register at the Social Security Agency. They just see it as another way for the government to collect additional taxes and fees. But the moment they see they can benefit from Social Security, that they can go to hospital, they definitely are willing to pay for their own taxes.
Hopefully that will also resonate in Nigeria. But I mean, I wanted to bring you back maybe to a currency aspect. The Naira, I will tell you, on a Bloomberg News perspective, any story on the Naira goes viral on the internet. How would a Naira devaluation, as it is expected, impact the NSIA's assets and investment outlook, would you say?
Just to give context, NSI is actually organized in 3 separate and ring-fenced funds. We have a stabilization fund that provides stabilization support during times of economic duress. We have a savings fund for intergenerational equity. Both of those funds are actually fund of funds. And then we have a domestic infrastructure fund. Our source of funding is actually in US dollars. So the receipt of funds from the sovereign is in US dollars. And we hold our capital in US dollars. So to the extent that there is any devaluation, the impact is very minimal.
Right. It looks like the audience hasn't sent in any questions over, but please feel free to send some because this is a riveting discussion. But Mr. Abe, I want to just bring us back again to the common framework, which is proving slow and cumbersome in process in getting creditors like China to work with traditional Paris Club lenders in agreeing to debt relief for countries like Zambia, for instance, which faces a cash flow crunch if debtors can't find a common solution. China, it seems, has faced a lot of blame for holding up that process, especially from the US. Has the common framework become a new battleground, so to speak, for these two world powers? In other words, is it a case of the grass suffering as two elephants fight?
Very
easy. Good luck.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I have issues with the framing of the question. So I think stepping back, these are points that Anne-Laure made very nicely earlier. I think what clearly happened in the 2010s was China emerging as a very important source of financing for developing countries, notably in Africa. But still, I think it's really important to put some numbers in context in terms of obligations to China by African countries. I only have the number for sub-Saharan Africa at hand, but I think China obligations to China account for about 6-7% of total debt of sub-Saharan African countries. Now, within this number, there are a number of countries, I would say 7-8 countries, where the share of debt to China is quite significant. So I don't want to overlook that. But one challenge that we had was, of course, China not being part of the Paris Club structure. We did not have a forum where bilateral creditors, and China had become a really important creditor, could discuss how debt to the official sector would be treated. So the creation of the common framework, I would say, was a moment in time when the pandemic hit, when we were all working together, which brought China to work closely with Paris Club members on the context of the G20. So it actually was one of the ways in which, if you will, the global powers were agreeing to find a way in which they would work together. So in that respect, I think common framework, in contrast to the way you framed the question, was actually the coming together of and the creation of a multilateral spirit to help address the most vulnerable countries with the debt challenge as they are emerging. Now, that said, I think, given the fact that you now have new creditors who've never provided debt treatment, like China, Brazil, several other countries, it has taken quite a bit of time to come up with debt treatment, and this has been to the detriment of countries in the region. But I have to also say that, it is a very, very important framework, and it is slow, but it is making progress. So just to give a couple of examples, Chad has already gotten debt treatment, and that has already been ticked off. Of course, we've had initial agreement to provide financing assurances, so the IMF could proceed with providing financing for Zambia, also for Ghana very recently, and we're now waiting for a final, reaching understandings on a memorandum of, an MOU, memorandum of understanding with Zambia, and very, very active discussions that are taking place. and we're very, very hopeful that something will come through in the next few weeks. So there is progress, albeit slow. So I don't think we want to throw the baby with the bathwater. And I think the common framework, just needs improving.
What is very important from what Abe said is the diversity of creditors that you have. Because we are talking about China, and he mentioned a couple of others, but you also have India, who happens to be also involved in a lot of situations, Turkey. So indeed the complexity of the debt, be it on the bilateral side, as we are discussing, be it also more on the multi or plurilateral side, because you have also a lot of entities that have emerged more recently, also on the regional level, right? That kind of like also create new categories. And of course, those countries, and a lot of countries, have also accessed the bond market. So you can sometimes be successful, as Morocco was highly successful, but sometimes you've incurred too much debt, you then cannot go back to the capital market. It's a very dispersed market, because who is actually your creditor? You may not know them in themselves, right? They may have changed. So all of this, in fact, we're talking about debt complexity. What the common framework aimed to achieve, I'm making it now super simplistic, but was to try to have a frame to deal with those complexity. So, of course, it's never going to be perfect, because each country has some specificities, right? But this is what we have to face, a multi-complex bondholders or debt holders with different layers of debt, different types of debt, making it hugely complex to solve. So I guess the point is, let's try to avoid restructuring if we can. I guess that's what we are talking about.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to have these kind of conversations. So we're running out of time. In 30 seconds each, what can the international world do to aid, to support the resolution of Africa's debt crisis, Minister?
In 3 points, hopefully it will take 30 seconds. First time, without being provocative or not blaming anyone, I think we need a timely response. SVB, it took 2 weeks to find a solution. We still discussing MOUs for Zambia, Chad, etc. So I think, we are running out of time. Second message. The annual meetings of IMF and World Bank are taking place in Marrakesh, October this year. 50 years back, it's been 50 years that they have not been back to Africa. So hopefully the MDBs will come with proper solutions for the African continent and globally for the middle income and the vulnerable countries. And the last point, we didn't have time to talk about it, is governance, because we just use this type of conference, and I would like to thank the organization to raise the voice of the Global South and Africa, but we need more, because we don't have enough representation, we don't have representations in the G20, we don't have enough voting rights, so something needs to be done around governance for this continent.
Abe, 30 seconds.
I'm tempted to say I strongly second everything Minister Nadia said. That's very much something that we're working on, including for the annual meetings. But just 2 quick points from my side. I think, in terms of easing the debt burden for the region, the solutions are going to be very country-specific. Not only is the creditor base very different, but also the particular circumstances of the countries are very, very different, and the needs are very different. To the extent we can generalize, I think 2 things are needed. One, most countries are facing a liquidity crunch, and for those countries, significant external financing, which is at concessional level, is really needed to help the region go through this difficult period and avoid even more difficult debt challenges going further. Second, I think also, there are long-term challenges to which Africa has not contributed, but is facing the brunt of. The climate, of course, is one of those, and I think the international community would be being incredibly myopic by not investing in the labor force of the future. Africa will be providing the lion's share of the global labor force going forward, and it really is important that we invest in health, education, infrastructure now, so that we can have a resilient region going forward.
Anne?
I would like really to strongly echo the point on liquidity, because if I may, and Abebe will not like it, but sustainability can be dealt with. Liquidity, you have a strong issue when you have a liquidity crisis. So I think this should be really our priority, maybe more than the sustainability to start with. First comment. Second comment, and I think it was a very good comment made on the local currency. We didn't really have time to discuss this, but when you have a currency mismatch, when you borrow in dollar or euros, and when your currency is a different one, I mean, clearly you're putting yourself into an extra burden. I know it's also a priority and things that people work on, but we need much more to develop those local markets. This is absolutely critical if we want sustainable economies.
Great. Aminu?
So problem with going last, all the great points have been made, but I think the only thing to add is empathy on the part of the creditors, particularly because, this issue around debt restructuring has been a movie that has been played over and over and over again. So just appealing to them to still retain that empathy as to what the impact of debt renegotiations are, on the one hand. But on the other hand, there also needs to be responsibility on the part of the creditors that debt forgiveness comes with a certain amount of commitment to governance, to sustainability, and to detailed thought processes around the utilization of these funds.
Thank you so much. We could talk all day about this subject, of course. We'll continue it next year, right?
Okay.
Thank you all.